So thank you so much for having me. My name is Rebekah O'Brien. I'm here to talk about the self-diagnosed bisexual, that is me. Some background: in childhood, I was diagnosed with ADHD and unspecified behavior issues that now are in line with what we call autistic traits. So I've diagnosed myself as autistic in lockdown, as autistic behaviors like stimming and things like that just started happening out of nowhere. And I had a flood of memories from having done so in childhood. And I noticed that there are a lot of parallels between finding out late in life that you're autistic and early in life that you're bisexual. So through the lens of history for both queer and autistic communities, um, and my own personal narrative, I hope to state the case for why we absolutely need self-diagnosed autistics and autism research. I would like to issue a trigger warning in talking about our history that I will be bringing up eugenics, bullying, assault, incarceration, and suicide. So I wanted to tell you that all before I got started so I didn't catch anyone off guard. I think it's important to start with our history because history informs the present and the present is going to inform our future. So the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is used in the United States, where I'm originally from, although I live in Canada right now. The DSM-1 we see in 1952. And prior to the DSM, there were eugenics campaigns against both queer people and autistic people. And in 1952, what happens with this is it's supposed to be a scientific document created by experts. It becomes very difficult for both communities to push back against the stigmas once it is codified as science. So for the first issue in the queer context, I use the term queer because I'll be walking through history for things that were once called homosexuality and then get updated with multiple things until we're now at LGBTIAQ2+. I screwed up the order of that. Excuse my executive dysfunction. I'm so sorry. So queerness is listed as a sociopathic personality disturbance. Around this time, we have things like Alan Turing, who was chemically castrated as an alternative to incarceration for his sexual orientation. In the 50s, we've got Dr. Evelyn Hooker around this time studying homosexuality empirically. This is at the behest of one of her queer students. And I call this out because it will create a trend that we're going to see many times, which is that research gets better not on account of non-autistic researchers of autism and queerness, but because the communities themselves have been advocating over and over for change. Now, the autistic context in the DSM-1 is it's related to schizophrenic reactions in children. And to give you an idea of how we're talked about, psychologist Paul Fuller referred to us as vegetative human organisms, behaviorally lower in the scale than dogs, rats, and cats. I use the term autistic instead of person with autism because it is something that I am, not something I am with. I am not a person with bisexual. And to me, the only way to dissociate those parts of my personality is to destroy them, which has been tried throughout history. And I don't mean to disparage anyone who uses person first language. Some autistics still prefer that. So the DSM has gone through many iterations, the DSM-2 in 1968. Now homosexuality is listed as sexual deviation. This is as a push from gay activists who deny that queerness is a disorder. Dr. Robert Spitzer meets with gay activists to change this definition. Around the historical context of this time in the United States, there are arrests, bar raids, police brutality. And 1 year after this is printed, we'll see the Stonewall riot, which is largely thought to be the start of the modern gay rights movement, although it was certainly not the first or only riot of its nature, pushing back against police brutality of queer people. In the autistic context, it's still associated with schizophrenia in childhood, listing autistic, atypical, and withdrawn behavior. In the 60s, we also see Ole Ivor Lovis, who abused autistic children to get them to change their autistic traits, and his work would become the basis for both gay conversion therapy and applied behavior analysis. Both forms of therapies, I'll put that in air quotes, that are used today. In the 1970s, queer activists disrupt an APA meeting, demanding to talk about homosexuality being in the DSM, insisting that it shouldn't be there. 1973, homosexuality on its own is cut from the DSM, leaving ego-dystonic homosexuality and sexual orientation disturbance. Now, what happened here is that the nomenclature committee for the APA are now talking about what exactly is a mental disorder. They come to the conclusion that it's something that regularly causes subjective distress or associated with generalized impairment in social effectiveness of functioning, which is terminology that is very close to how autistics are described even today. So what's left in is somebody who feels disturbed by feelings of their own homosexuality, not homosexuality on its own. In the 70s, we see laws that start decriminalizing homosexuality. And in the 80s, we see the AIDS epidemic. And the reason I call that out is following years and generations of stigma, many queer people would not get tested because that would mean coming out, which could cost them their families, their homes, their jobs, therefore their access to food, water, and shelter. The president of the United States at this time, Ronald Reagan, literally laughed out loud in response to the AIDS epidemic. This has become very hard to push back against the stigma as a community when the president of the United States reacts to your death this way. The autistic context for the DSM-3, it's no longer associated with childhood schizophrenia, and it lists criteria specific to autism, like language development, attachments to objects, pervasive lack of responsiveness to other people. In the 80s, we see Jim Sinclair starting the autism rights movement. So what we're starting to see are these definitions. These are neurotypical and heterosexual judgments of our behavior, setting us apart from some perceived norm, mainly heterosexual and neurotypical. And if we're being honest, white heterosexual, white neurotypical. I think it's very important to call out who is and is not represented in autism research, diagnosticians, therapists, and people who work with us. So in the DSM-4 in the 1990s and 2000s, we have gender identity disorder, which is listed as a disturbance causing distress or impairment in functioning related to one's feelings of one's own sex. That's their description, as if they wanted to be the other sex versus what I would say now, which is not presenting as the sex that you are. In 1996, we have the Defense of Marriage Act. For people not from the United States and unfamiliar, the President of the United States signed an act that meant marriage is legally defined as between a man and a woman. It's codified in federal law. In the 90s and 2000s, there are fights for marriage equality, housing rights. There are notable murders of gay individuals who are teens, like Matthew Shepard and Brandon Teena, physically assaulted and murdered by people their own age. Well, other people who are around their age. I'm sorry, I don't know their exact ages. But something else that's important in the 90s and 2000s is that I come out as bisexual as a 14-year-old, my first year of high school. And I'm doing this in the context of people like me being murdered for our orientation. And I'll talk a bit in a minute about what that meant for me. It is impossible for me not to intertwine the murder of queer teenagers and the President of the United States signing the Defense of Marriage Act, and the impact that somebody with such an important position in the United States has said about us, following generations of incarceration, murder, forced sterilization, attempts to keep us from reproducing or adopting children. Things that also happen in the autistic community. In the DSM-4 and 4R, autistic disorder is now separated as several subcategories, each with perceived deficits. In the 1998, we get the term neurodiversity. And the sociologist Judy Singer, writer Harvey Bloom, and other notable activists in the autistic community, putting forth the idea that we are not disordered versus some norm, but rather that we are just part of normal human variation, something that we are still fighting for today as recognition. Jim Sinclair starts the Autism Network International, which starts connecting people and building our culture after generations of having wrecking balls taken through it by eugenics campaigns. And I think it's important to note, calling these out, that the effects of codifying us as disordered in a document like this don't evaporate when these are retracted or change their wording, that this permeates everyday aspects of our experience. So this is the current DSM-5. The bolding is mine. I just want to call attention. This is for autism spectrum disorder. How many times the words deficits, abnormal, failure, poorly, total lack, and absence of interest in peers are used. This is completely pathologizing language. Described that is, it's not a description of our internal experience. It's a description of outside assessments of us by people who are not us and don't share our experiences. Now, the reason I've called out the comparison between the queer and autistic DSM entries is what we have are two human experiences defined as an aberration requiring a cure, even at the level of killing us, imprisoning us, changing us, preventing us from having children or reproducing, issues that are still occurring today. And I am at the intersection of both of these eugenics campaigns. And I would like to talk a little bit about how that has affected my life. I've noticed there are a lot of shared experiences, and there are some key places in which these experiences diverge. And I'd like to call out before I get started that this is one person's experience. There are certainly more than two multiple marginalized identities, and these things are not applied equally across everyone. Shared experiences, having your identity be considered an aberration leads to things like a lack of elders in your community. For much of our history, our elders, although we certainly do have some, but many were murdered, institutionalized, sterilized, or other harassed out of existing authentically, which means that our communities haven't been able to come together. We wouldn't have known who we were looking for necessarily, and it was not safe to do so. And their lack means there are less people to advocate for our rights and to define our experiences. For example, as long as I've experienced attraction to multiple genders, but I wouldn't learn the term bisexual for many years yet. I had the term gay and I had the term straight, and those were the only terms I had, and I knew that neither was defining my experience. So this left me with a lot of questions, but not only me, everyone else around me who wanted to know why I was attracted to multiple genders, and was I gay or straight, and what percent gay and what percent straight was I, and questions like this that lead to gaslighting about my identity, interrogation, indications that I am broken, doing it for attention, doing it to feel different, that I am too confused to know myself. And all of these are things I heard about what I would now call autistic traits growing up. My whole life, I stimmed, I experienced autistic burnout, hyperacusis, monotropism, selective mutism, and I did not have terms for any of these things. I didn't know what they were. And I would like to somehow convey to you the terror of experiencing selective mutism, but not having that term, not knowing what's happening. If you don't experience it, the words are fully formed in your brain, but your mouth won't move. You can't communicate, you can't speak, and you don't know why it's happening. People will really interrogate you once you can talk for anything besides selective mutism that I've listed, but especially for that one, interrogate you on why it's happening. And all you can say is, I don't know, which they take as a confession that there is no reason for it. But what it actually is literally the words we said, I don't know. I didn't have the terminology for it. There's stigma in both the outside group and inside the group. So inside the group in queer communities, there's a term in the United States and Canada, and perhaps outside I'm not as familiar, called gold star lesbian, which refers to a queer woman who's never been with a man before, indicating that she is of higher value as a partner because of her lack of history with men. Now, bisexuals, just by our nature, might have a history with men, and thus we are often less valued as partners. There's a lot of biphobia. There's, even within the queer community, there are notions that we are confused, we're fake, we're not to be trusted. I've been pulled aside at parties and had people interrogate me on whether a bisexual person they're thinking about dating but I have never met before is going to cheat on them. And I don't know, because I'm bisexual though, they think I should know. And additionally, that I should admit to some perceived fault of our disloyalty. Now, outgroup perceptions of bisexuals when I'm talking to heterosexuals are often very similar. To that, I would add the notion that we are for the consumption of heterosexual men. I've many times been demanded to perform a sexual act with another woman I do not know for the convenience and entertainment of a man who is present. For the autistic stigma outside the group, I mean, we definitely know there's notions that we are deficits, we're emotionless, we have no empathy, we communicate objectively poorly versus simply differently. In the in-group, I might deal with stigma that I don't have a diagnosis. I have found the group to be pretty accepting of self-diagnosis, but I can still run into exactly the same rhetoric that I hear about bisexuals. It's for attention, it's to feel different, I'm confused, I'm fake, not to be trusted, and so on. In both the in-group and the out-group, I can hear things like, I don't look autistic. I certainly don't present flat in tone. Emotionless is not how I don't think anybody would describe me that way. As far as being bisexual, I'm married to a man, which is taken as a tacit admission that I am straight rather than what it is, which is that I'm monogamous, and bisexuality does allow for marrying a man. Both my queerness and my autistic experience have been described by professionals as behavioral choices that I could change. And these stigmas are based on stereotypes by people who are not us, but have an imbalance of power to describe our experiences. There's a lot of trauma in both of these groups. You are surviving 2 forms of ongoing eugenics, and it's not just the weight of knowing that. For example, when you are locked away for generations, you aren't getting to define appropriate workplace norms. What is professional? What is common sense? What is dangerous? The way, say, meltdowns are viewed. Whose thoughts and experiences define what doctors, teachers, bosses, police officers do, and what they expect you to do. Bullying is very common. There's a book, Bullying Scars, that calls out that being different in any way is a reason for targeting, but it calls out especially queerness and autism for their increased risks of experiencing bullying. Lifelong bullying can lead to self-regulation issues, the development of your brain structures and neuroendocrine responses being affected, anxiety, depression, and drug use. Co-regulation, as in being able to regulate with your community, is not happening if you don't have it. So for a bisexual person, you might not ever get found family. I don't know if that term's in much use outside the US, but in the queer community, many of us can be ousted from our homes or choose to leave due to what we experience there. And you wind up with a small group of people who are also queer, and they become something like a family, and this is called found family. And that's not happening if there's heavy biphobia, and that's also not happening with a group of neurotypical queer people who would not accept an autistic, even if they don't know that person's autistic. Now, as a non-diagnosed autistic person, you might not even know what to look for to find your community. Certainly, I never thought that I was autistic or would have thought to think about it. The only reason I did is because in lockdown, my executive dysfunction got so bad. And I knew that I had a childhood diagnosis with ADHD, which is not very common for women my age. And then kind of following down that rabbit hole led me to the discoveries in the autistic community, and otherwise I'd just be still here without it. Now, Bullying Scars also mentions that parental support has a positive impact on resilience when you experience bullying, and that's not happening if your parents are homophobic and you cannot tell them that you're queer. You can't come out to your parents, or they think that you deserve it. Might not also happen if what can be common, you are an undiagnosed autistic child of undiagnosed parents. Parents who might have extremely strong responses to autistic traits because they were bullied for it and they were abused for it. Something like hand flapping, vocalizations like echolalia, rocking, just the way that we communicate can be demonized and pathologized. It's also called out that queer students often report verbal and physical abuse at school and missing school for not feeling safe. I'll give 2 examples of what could be an average day for me, once as a child in elementary school and once in high school after I've come out. This is certainly not every day, but it could have been any day. It was so frequent. So in childhood, I might already be sent to school in clothes that are causing me extreme sensory distress issues, but I don't know that term. I've just said that I can't wear the clothes, and because I can't give a proper reason, I'm sent to them anyway. So I'm already in sensory distress. And I get there and the lights are bright and it's very loud, and that's extra sensory distress. I could be physically assaulted by multiple children at once at recess, under the view of a teacher who does not intervene and actually tells me it's my fault for my behavior. Could be publicly humiliated by a teacher in front of the class for not understanding written instructions, and having to ask. Exclusion, name calling, things that go along with bullying. This could be a very common daily thing for me as a child. So at this point, what happens is there are only so many times in so many years that you can tell people that this is happening and see nothing happen that you would actually still bother to report it. You kind of just accept it. So by the time I'm 14 years old, I've already had almost a decade of incessant bullying and watching anyone in charge not help me. So when I come out at 14 years old, what happens later that day, adults I've never met before threw bricks and bottles at me out of a moving car while screaming slurs about my sexual identity. This would go on for most of high school until I left that town. I would be walking down the halls at school and have slurs screamed at me, physically assaulted again in front of teachers who are not doing anything. Somebody in my class was the son of one of the police officers in town, and the person in my class was extremely homophobic, which led me to believe his father likely was too, so I didn't bother with any police interventions either. Now, I think it's important to understand that these definitely compound over time. These are very difficult experiences, and they're not in isolation. When I talk to other queer people and other autistic people, this seems to be pretty common, which is going to lead to masking. Now, masking does look different for queer people and for autistic people in my experience. As far as queerness, I know what I'm masking. I know if I would say out loud to somebody about my sexual orientation, but as an undiagnosed autistic, no, you don't know what you're masking. Your life is a windfall of constant punishment, verbal and physical, maybe from everyone you know, including your friends and family. Trauma is causing masking. It is a trauma response. It is not something I can put down and put on at will. And I often don't even know what it is that I would be doing. In autistic circles, I often find that there's a lot of us asking how we unmask, and a lot of us don't know, especially for late diagnosed autistics. You don't know why the negative responses were happening your whole life until you find out that you're autistic. As far as queerness, again, I would certainly know what I'd be saying or not, but it's not as clear as you might think. For example, if I'm at a workplace and if you've ever been in a situation where someone shares a story and then everyone around shares a similar story, like everyone's telling a story about where they went on a date to the movies or something, something like that. If I'm to tell one of these stories, the pronouns in that story alone can indicate my sexual identity, my sexual orientation. And I can choose to very tightly manage those pronouns, try and switch them out with he, try and say they and dodge it, but that's a very high executive function task. Executive function being something I struggle with from autism and ADHD. I can also choose to not share this story, but because of autistic traits, I might already be considered not social, not interested in my coworkers, and there's a risk to it as well. Now, when you don't mask, your job, housing, freedom, ability to adopt children can be on the line for both queer and autistic people. And masking also has extra safety considerations for people who experience more police violence. It's very common in autistic circles to talk about, unmasking and the importance of it and how traumatizing it is and how much it impacts your mental health, and this is true. But until we address the fact that it is simply not safe for some people to do so, I'll give the example of Matthew Rushin. I don't know if anyone knows of this case, but there's a Black man in the United States who's autistic and was driving a car and he had a seizure. He hit another car. And somebody who responded at the scene said, "What were you doing trying to kill yourself?" And as a form of echolalia, he responds, "Trying to kill myself." And when I read this story, I shuddered because I've done something like this many times, and that was taken as a tacit admission of guilt. And he was incarcerated. I believe his ruling's been overturned now, but please look into that case. It's an important one. And we cannot talk about masking without referring to stories like this, because the experience of being autistic is not universal. Coming out. So as an autistic person, coming out might be necessary at work for accommodations you need, to explain why you can't sit next to somebody necessarily, to explain why you can't be under certain lights, why you might require something like noise canceling headphones. It can also be a big risk due to the stigma. There might be questions about your employability, what liabilities the employers might have if they're not aware of how to have an autistic person on staff. I'd also like to call out that there are workplaces that have autism hiring programs, and almost universally they're for programmers. Data engineer, something like that, computer engineer, network engineer, it kind of feels like they just watched Rain Man and figured that that's the kind of person they should have. I don't see anyone looking for an autistic HR person, for example. Although there's no reason I can think of other than stigma that an autistic person should not be in HR or something like that. As far as being queer at work, it's not necessary to come out necessarily. You will have to tightly manage anything you talk about. You can't talk as freely about things, and that's a high cognitive load. But if you're running into something like homophobia at work and you need to go talk to HR about it, and you've already talked to them about autistic issues, you run the risk of just being viewed as somebody who complains about everything. And I've been in that situation before, and you really, really have to tightly pick your battles in that case, leaving you often just exposed to trauma that you've decided to deal with for your safety. Stereotype narrow representations, this is getting less true over time, but for someone my age growing up, both queer and autistic representations tended to be very stereotyped. They tended to appeal to neurotypical or cishet audiences, cisgender heterosexual audiences. The characters often appeared in isolation, so you don't see an interplay of multiple queer people or multiple autistic people in one form of, like, one show or one movie as much over time. They can be very shallow when they're used in this way. They also tend to be white, male, cis, appearing physically able-bodied. Okay, there are some ways in which our experiences diverge. Queer culture can be very inaccessible for an autistic person. The club culture, dancing, lights, sounds, these are all extremely sensory overwhelming, as is a pride parade, let alone somebody who might have comorbid conditions like Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, who's going to have difficulty standing in place for a very long time, and without many places to get away. And especially with something like a massive pride celebration, which I definitely support, for sure. You're not going to be able to duck away somewhere quiet. They're often very full with other people because so many people are in the area. It can be very hard to get away from the sensory overwhelm. It can be difficult to advocate. For example, some big news in Canada is that the government is in talks of banning gay conversion therapy, which is very rightly celebrated by the community. However, as an autistic queer person, if you try and talk about applied behavior analysis, you'll find out that many people in the queer community might actually have their children in it or are actively supporting it. And if you try and talk about the relationship of ABA to gay conversion therapy, you'll often be told rhetoric like, well, gay people aren't disabled, as if autistic people deserve this sort of treatment based on, again, our history of stigma and being labeled as deficits by professionals. Other big news, there's a notable queer icon, Britney Spears, who's fought recently against her conservatorship, which is that her father owns her assets and much of her life. And this is rightly causing outrage in the queer community. But if you try and bring up that this often happens to autistic people, no one wants to hear it, and certainly no one wants to back you. The dating stigma looks different in these communities. So there's stigma that bisexuals are greedy, fake, unloyal, confused. There's stigma that autistics are cold, emotionless, lack empathy, objectively bad at communication versus just different. And there might be questions about our mental ability to even be a partner. There will be questions about whether somebody who is your partner will wind up with an autistic child if they have a child with you. Now, if you're in the intersection of both of these sets, it can cause a lot of problems. For example, if you're on a date with a woman and you are an undiagnosed autistic woman, you don't know that you have touch sensitivity, so you recoil from a touch, which is taken as a tacit confession that you are not actually bisexual or that you are not actually comfortable with the experience of being with women, instead of that the touch was gentle and therefore very jarring, which is counterintuitive, I think, for people who don't experience it, but light touches to me feel like sandpaper. It's something I have to pull my body away from right away, like a hot stove. And all of these things cause compounding rejection sensitivity dysphoria. To experience them both at the same time, it weighs on you a lot. Looking for information about these identities and parts of my identity is a very different experience. If I Google things about the queer community, I will definitely come across our trauma, but I also come across our culture, our hope, our art without much difficulty. When I look for autistic content, I'm often sent to ABA websites or Autism Speaks. It's mostly just a lot of trauma trying to talk to our community, especially late diagnosis. It is getting better, but we've just had so much put against us as far as being able to communicate. I think the internet's making a big difference there for us to be able to find community. A lot of what I come across when trying to engage with autistic content are things that are actually extremely anti-autistic. Very pathologizing language, and almost everything is aimed for children as well. Autistic adults are often left out of the conversation. It's important to note that we experience the trauma, bullying, rejection, the lack of understanding, whether we're diagnosed or not. whether we have this terminology or not. So we need self-diagnosed autistics in autism research, not only for us, but for researchers as well. The diagnosis involves a privilege that's often held by the same groups throughout history, namely middle class or higher, white, cis, more able-bodied, more access to privilege, things like that. And as a result, we're not getting a complete picture of autism. It doesn't look the same across generations. It might not look the same across different cultures. It might not look the same across the gender spectrum. And the narratives on autism need to come from a diverse group of autistics because the experiences themselves are so diverse, and the terminology to describe our experiences comes from these stories and these narratives. Remember, our numbers have been reduced by eugenics campaigns, so we're definitely not getting a complete picture. Proper support for autistics also cannot exist without understanding autism. As somebody with late diagnosis, you might have a rush of traumatic memories. For somebody like me who experiences hyperphantasia, please call it out if you don't, like someone let me know if you don't know what that is, so I can describe it for you. If you experience hyperphantasia,
please describe.
Excellent. Okay.
Please describe, Rebekah. Thank you.
And also, Rebekah, do you want to time check?
Sure, that'd be great.
You've had 30 minutes.
I have. Okay. Well, I'm coming close to the end. So I want to definitely leave some time for questions. I'll try and go through this quickly. So hyperphantasia means essentially I see a movie that I can interact with in my head when I think about something. If you tell me you've gone to a store, I don't know, British store, Waitrose, is that one? Is that a British store? I think so. If you tell me you've gone to the store, my mind will populate with the store and you moving around in it, and I can hear the music and I can see the lights. I can see what you're picking up. I can have you turn it over and I can read the nutrition label. Obviously, none of these things are real because I'm not in that situation, but my brain populates with it. So when I experience a traumatic memory, I'm seeing a movie of it. It's like a 3D world I'm walking around in. It's a very, very strong response. And for a ruminator, for somebody with ADHD, for whom time passes differently, it feels like it's earlier that day. Every single time you remember it. We need to reform the notion that heterosexual neurotypicals are more human or more correct than queer autistics, and that they're not just one part of the human experience. Currently, so much of the research sets us apart as a deficit, and that's why we need us, because we are the only people who can speak to a lifetime of being autistic and who can speak to the long-term effects of what happens to autistic children. Lack of understanding autistics leads to our ongoing eugenics, even in the form of programs that are training us out of our autistic behaviors. We drive research for what autistic people actually need and not what's to benefit neurotypical comfort with our presence. For example, there's a lack of research in critical quality of life areas like our trauma, burnout, unmasking, sleep, GI issues, where the experiences of white boys and men who are autistic diverge from the experiences of other autistics, and research that validates the set of our pathology, like the double empathy research by Dr. Damian Milton is a really good example of something I'd like to see more of. Poor understanding of how we communicate can lead to misdiagnosis, like treatments that don't work, and attention to serious and worsening symptoms. So how much of the diagnostic criteria is related to autistic trauma specifically, and how many treatments are available that address autistic trauma specifically? On our experience with the world, this impacts our financial instability and job prospects. It can lead to imprisonment. Both queer people and autistic people are overrepresented in prison. Queer people are known to experience longer sentencing, higher rates of assault from both other inmates and staff. And queer youth are also very overrepresented in the prison system. And it's important to note that when they are, you can't do anything about the textures that go on your body, the food you eat, the lights, the sounds that you're exposed to, or the temperature that you're exposed to, all of which are things known to improve autistic regulation. In the United States, there are still places where doctors can refuse to treat queer people. With the overlap, that means autistics won't be treated. To be clear, no one deserves to not be treated, but it does mean that many autistics with comorbid conditions in areas that have doctors like this might have very little options. The lack of us can lead to improper or harmful goals at school, like eye contact goals, or forcing us to be social with children who traumatize us through their actions because it's on a sheet of paper that says we have to go talk to 3 students that day. And undiagnosed neurodivergent parents raising undiagnosed neurodivergent children. I've mentioned that already. For time, I'll continue going. I have worries about the worldwide impact of releasing our stories. There are still parts of the world where you can be put to death for being homosexual or for being queer. And I don't know what that means to release information that shows the link between queer people and autistic people. I don't know what it means for people who are actively looking at eugenics of both queer and autistic people to expose this link. I don't know what it means for somebody who's got a diagnosed autistic child and is severely homophobic, how that's going to work out for their child if it's common knowledge that there is a link there. Certainly not a given. It's just there is overlap and the numbers vary all over the place. Our suicide rates can be very high. According to the position statement on autistic LGBTIQA+ identity from the website Rephrasing Autism, 1 in 8 autistic neurodivergent young people report a suicide attempt in the last year, and 1 in 3 report a suicide attempt in their lifetime. That's more than twice as high as queer people without a disability and 5 times higher than the same age group who are neither queer nor disabled. Over half of queer youth who are identified as neurodivergent felt unsafe or uncomfortable at school in the past year. 1 in 5 reports physical harassment and assault based on their gender in their lifetime, and over 1 in 10 has experienced it in the last year. We cannot afford for research and professionals to get around to the right thing. If it takes 10 years for the research we say is needed to be done, that's 10 more years of suicide in my community. So what we need to see to address this is my last slide. I'll try and wrap up soon. We need accessible diagnostic process involving autistic input. Accessible to me means free, and it also means involving autistics as part of the process, who are there to interpret any questions the person might have and what they're seeing. We need to prioritize what the autistics say the research needs to focus on, and we need to prioritize multiply excluded autistics and rapidly update the diagnostic criteria based on what we learn. We need to see people of color, queer, people with comorbid conditions, homeless autistics, people who've been jailed, and the elderly, people who are finding out they're autistic after double my lifetime of masking. It's important to remember that masking, the trauma caused by it, compounds over time. It does not get easier. These are people who've done it for 80 years in some cases. We need research that validates our existence, and I want us to study neurotypicals and heterosexuals as if they weren't the baseline for humanity. I want to know where the theory of mind is for a group of people that have chemically castrated us, that have imprisoned us. Where is the theory of mind for people who have hit us, trying to get us to stop being autistic? What is their implicit bias? And I want a worldwide push against racism, sexism, homophobia, and ableism, not only because it's the right thing to do, but because when you're at multiple intersections of marginalized identities, things compound. So I'm going to leave you with a rhetorical question. If we had generations of autistic community without the lingering impact of multiple active campaigns to eradicate us from this earth, who could we be? What contributions to society could be made? You don't know, and what's truly heartbreaking is neither do we. So please bring autistics in and empower us to guide the future of the autism industry. Our lives literally depend on it.